All right, I have 9 o'clock. Thank you all for attending. I hope that this course will be beneficial to everyone and will help the organization meet the new requirements that have been brought forth by the ACR this year. This course is going to be pretty technical. I know we've had a lot of folks in administrative positions that have wanted to take it just so they have experience with it, and I am all for that, and I think that that's a good thing. I just want to kind of warn or caveat that with there will be a lot of technical stuff, and the reason is this course is meant to in some ways substitute for board certification by the American Board of Magnetic Resonance Safety, which is a very technical test. And so we'll get into the kind of the motivations for having this course and how it's structured later, but just know that it will be a pretty technical course. Today will be the least technical. We're going to talk about a lot of unfortunately boring stuff today, like regulatory stuff, but we will get into some details of kind of the overall risks that we encounter in the MR environment. The intention of this course is that we will be able to certify certain members of our staff and faculty as MR safety officers, MR medical directors, or MR safety experts at the completion of the course. That certification will be from IU Health. So there have been questions about, can I use this certification to go get a new job? You certainly could try, but we can't guarantee you that they're going to think IU Health certification is good enough for wherever you'd like to go work. But more than happy to let you try. But this is going to allow people to meet these designations within IU Health. All right, I'm Jason Parker. I'm the chair of our MR Safety Committee. I'm an MRI physicist by training. I also do a lot of nuclear work here at IU Health. So, outline of our talk. What is this and why are we doing it now? We're going to spend the most time today on this particular topic, and this will be what I consider to be the more boring aspect of the discussion. We'll talk about the new ACR MRI safety manual that came out in 2020, which motivated a lot of the changes that we're seeing in the MR safety community right now. We'll talk about, at a somewhat high level, the 3 different classifications and what it takes, what the responsibilities are for each of the 3 different classifications. And then we'll talk a little bit about the tests, passing criteria, your certification, and how you maintain the certification at the end of that section. Then we'll go into how MRI safety is organized and administered at IUH and throughout our partnering hospitals. This course is extended to Eskenazi as well as researchers in IUSM. And so it is a broad audience, and I'm going to try to talk about how MR safety is administered across all these kind of heterogeneous organizations, recognizing that each organization has its own policies and procedures, and we can't always pass a new policy down to everyone at once. Talk about our MR safety committee, the approval to get policy, the process to get policies approved, how you deal with pushy patients and pushy ordering physicians. This is a new one that we've started to encounter in the last year, a lot more of, and we're getting physicists and MRMDs involved in helping to deal with these situations. Then the technical part for today will be the 4 primary dangers or physical phenomena that we deal with in MR. And you are going to want to pay attention to things like units. That's the kind of stuff that will be on the test. You're not going to have to like work out equations, but you want to have a good understanding of these different physical effects, what they are, and how they might contribute to creating danger in the MR environment. And I think knowing the units is kind of one important factor in that. Last 5 minutes, we'll talk about the rest of the course. So that'll be all the other presenters that we have. You all should have seen that email that I sent out recently, and then we'll have time for Q&A. I just want to say, if you have questions throughout the talk, feel free to interrupt. I prefer that rather than droning on for 45 minutes. So if there's something you want to talk about or address in the middle of the presentation, just unmute yourself and feel free to talk. All right. Any questions so far? Sounds like everyone can hear me and see everything, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. All right. What is this and why are we doing it now? So the ACR is why we're doing this. Many of you may know that since 2002, the ACR has been periodically releasing these safe practice guidelines. They released one in 2002, then in 2007, I think, and then an update in 2009, and then 2013. And a lot of times they're like published as academic papers, but everyone's expected to somehow read them. Nothing was required in the guidelines. They were all just recommendations from the ACR on how to ensure safety in your environment. But there was an update that came out in 2019 that was kind of like preparing everyone for a big change. And that big change happened this year in April when the ACR released version 1 of the ACR manual on MR safety. This is one of those keywords. You'll be seeing this on the test. This is kind of the reason that we're here today because of this new ACR manual on MR safety that was released in April. All of you should have gotten this in emails from me multiple times now. If you don't have it, you can Google ACR manual and MR safety and it will come up quickly. If you have any problems, let me know. I'll get you another copy. I think it's on our website right now too. Subsequently, just a month later, and obviously keep in mind this was all in the mix of coronavirus, in May 2020, the ACR then updated its supervising physician requirements to state that the supervising physician for an ACR accredited MR service was responsible for ensuring the service followed the new manual on MR safety. And you can follow this link if you want to actually read about it. But kind of the point to make here is that as an accreditation requirement, it is expected that the supervising physician now ensures compliance with this new manual, not with previous manuals, not with Joint Commission requirements, not with anything else, but with this manual. And that's what really kind of, from a regulatory perspective, set all these changes in stone, quote unquote stone. At that point, I think most of us said, wait a minute, is this a new de facto standard for all sites that have ACR accreditation? There's been a lot of debate about that in the last few months, and it isn't a completely agreed upon issue at this point, but I'll give you kind of my take and the organization's take at this point. So later on in May, near the end of the month, there were a lot of concerns that have been brought forward to the ACR about the requirement that the Mrmd supervise and ensure that the ACR manual and MR safety was followed. And in particular, the concern really related to staffing. As many of you know, one of the major issues with this new manual that we've been trying to deal with is it has requirements for staffing that we don't meet at a lot of our sites. In fact, very few sites actually meet. In particular, you have to have 2 people in the MR environment anytime a patient is present, and you have to have more than that if you have more than 1 magnet. There are requirements for how these people need to be trained, and it really kind of caused a lot of it really shook everyone up, as you can imagine. In response to that, the ACR released this new update to the physician requirements saying that staffing is not directly evaluated during the ACR MR accreditation review. However, if there is a question of inadequate staffing or safe practices of an ACR accredited facility, the ACR does reserve the right to request a response from the facility to ensure appropriate safety procedures are being followed and performed for that facility. Again, you can go on like LinkedIn and Facebook and forums and everywhere and read all kinds of different interpretations of all this. But where I've landed on these issues is that the supervising physician clearly is required by the ACR to ensure compliance with the new ACR manual on MR safety. That has never been changed. That is required by the Mrmd, i.e. the supervising physician. The ACR will not necessarily, or will not directly, we should say, evaluate MR safety compliance during an accreditation period. So if you had a, when you actually submit all your documents for ACR accreditation, there will not be a direct evaluation of your MR safety compliance. However, if the ACR comes out during a site visit and finds that you're not in compliance, or someone reports to the ACR that your site is not in compliance, or for some reason they get wind that something is not in compliance with the ACR manual on MR safety, the supervising physician I should probably say may, but will be targeted by the ACR for follow-up questioning and possibly disciplinary action. So we're kind of in a position here where one could argue that from a regulatory standpoint, compliance with the new manual is not required because the ACR does not directly evaluate compliance during accreditation, but our physicians will be held fully to the standard of ensuring that this manual is implemented. So our position is that we need to ensure short-term compliance with this manual using immediate and relatively simple changes, and we need to ensure long-term compliance with bigger, more expansive / expensive changes in the future. So this course is our attempt to create an immediate and relatively simple change that addresses one of the requirements in the new manual, and that is that you have to have identified MR safety officers, MR medical directors, and MR safety experts for each site that has a magnet. In the long term, we'd like to send people off to get trained by other more professional, I guess I should say, training organizations and take the official test from the American Board of MR Safety. Right now, due to COVID, travel restrictions, and honestly, financial challenges, it's just not possible to send all of us off to Vegas to take a 2-day course that costs several $1,000s and then take another test that costs $400. And so this is our immediate, quote unquote, simple change that we're making to address this one need. As I've alluded to, there's other changes like staffing that we're also making quote unquote simple changes to address here in the short term. Any questions? Okay. How about the Joint Commission? Well, the JC still has their own list of standards for MR safety, but they actually do cite the ACR guidance documents, so the previous documents. They haven't cited the new ACR manual and ACR MR safety manual and their requirements. But in general, the JC's requirements are considered less restrictive than the new ACR manual on MR safety. You can read about that here. Currently, in general, I should say, the field feels that if you have compliance with the new ACR guidance, you're going to be compliant with JC requirements. The JC requirements tend to be a little more broad and not as specific, especially as the new guidance that is in the ACR MR safety manual. So our plan is that we will meet the requirements of the ACR manual and MR safety, and in doing so, we'll also be compliant with JC. Okay, one of the most important questions for today: who is legally responsible for MR safety? And this is a question that I think goes through everyone's heads all the time, especially when we start dealing with challenging patients, or we know of an accident that has occurred or a near miss that has occurred. And I do want to be clear that according to the American Board of Magnetic Resonance Safety, at least in the United States, and under certain conditions, this can be extended internationally as well, the Mrmd, i.e. the supervising physician, is legally liable for safety in the MRI environment and the safe execution of the magnetic resonance examination, whether they are clinical or research in nature. And so with the ABMRS, the ACR, who has essentially agreed with the ABRS, you can read about that here, as well as numerous academic discussions that have been had at the RSNA, where they've had lawyers and MRMDs and other folks come together and have public discussions about legal liability. it is at this time felt or assumed that the MRMD is the primary legal the party that is primarily legally responsible for ensuring safety in the MR environment. So the MRSOs are here to support and ensure the MRMD is able to meet those requirements, and the MRSCs are here to support and ensure the MRMD can as well. You'll see here it does say among other parties. Talk about that in a moment. Okay, so this is kind of like a ranking of who is legally responsible. The supervising physician, and in the ACR MR safety manual, we refer to that position as the MR medical director. We're going to have an MR medical director or an MRMD for each site that has a magnet and is actively scanning patients. Next, the hospitals seem to be, at least historically, on the hook legally. So usually when all the cases I looked at yesterday and kind of developing this slide, everything I found was that when an accident occurred, the patient would sue the MRMD and sue the hospital. In a few cases, they would also sue the technologist. And the examples that I found where technologists were held legally liable, the hospital, i.e. the organization employing the technologist, accounted for all of the liability. So attorney's fees, rulings, et cetera, all were covered by the hospital because the technologist was performing their role as an employee of the hospital. There's a nice and long legal walkthrough provided here. This is geared more towards the MRMDs because there's a lot of concern about legal exposure to MRMDs. But you should know that in the case of an MR safety accident and a patient wants to attempt to recover some loss, so far they have gone after the MRMD, the hospital, and at times the technologist. I couldn't find evidence that physicists had been targeted. I expect now that MRSCs are going to be required at all locations by the new safety manual, we'll probably see physicists get thrown in here as well. And obviously we're going to have questions about, does the organization cover our liability or what? So just be aware of this. This kind of stuff will be on the test today. It is scary and nerve-wracking for all of us, but in general, I think if we have a robust system in place to ensure that safety is at the core of our mission in MRI, we can dramatically reduce the exposure that all of us have legally to consequences like these. Okay, so let's talk about the organizational structure. Again, we're talking about MRMD versus MRSO versus MRSE. The MRMD, their responsibility is assumed by a licensed physician / radiologist with appropriate training in MR safety. So the purpose of this course today is to ensure that the MRMD has appropriate training in MR safety. The MRMD assumes overall and ultimate responsibility for MR facility operational safety. This comes straight out of the ACR document. So this is word for word how the ACR sees it. The ACR then lays out these responsibilities for MRMDs. They're responsible for the safe execution of all MR examinations. They're responsible for the appointment of the MRSO and the advisory MRSE. They're responsible for the development, implementation, and maintenance of specific policies and procedures pertaining to the safe operation of MR services. Responsible for the implementation and maintenance of appropriate MR safety and quality assurance programs. Responsible for the development of an appropriate system for record keeping and analysis of adverse events. This is expected to happen in collaboration with the MRSO and MRSE. The MRMD is responsible for the development of an appropriate ongoing assessment of risk for the facility. And they're responsible for the development of an appropriate investigation and recording of all reported MR safety adverse events. This is a lot of responsibility, obviously, to put on the MRMDs, who are often clinical radiologists that are trying to read and perform their jobs, as well as take on all of this new responsibility. So in future parts of the talk today, we'll talk about how people like me, the chair of the MR Safety Committee, how the MR Safety Committee, how the administration, the MRSOs, the MRSCs, all of us work together to support the MRMDs and help them ensure that they meet these requirements, these responsibilities. All right, again, continuing in organizational structure, let's talk about the MRSO, which is the term for the MR safety officer. This responsibility will be assumed by a suitably trained individual, often an MR technologist. So far at IUH, we are planning on the MRSO always being an MR technologist who physically works at the site that they are the MRSO for. The ACR states that you could have multiple MRSOs appointed by a facility, but you should have a single MRSO that is identified as being responsible and oversees safety practices within a defined component of the MR practice at all times. It might be appropriate to name an MRSO for each facility location for each shift, the goal being that you have an MR safety officer present for each magnet at all times of the day. Again, that's going to be up to you all. You can have one MR safety officer that will meet the requirements of the new manual. They just need to be available to provide support to the other technologists when the MRSO is not physically present at the site. Since we're doing this for free and through our own organization, it probably, in my opinion, makes more sense to get more of your technologists certified as MRSOs. I don't think you can ever have too many MRSOs, but you do need to identify one person who is going to be identified as your MRSO according to the ACR manual. Responsibilities for the MRSO include ensuring accessibility at all times to the operators of active MR facilities, ensuring that proper policies and procedures of the Mrmd are implemented and enforced on an ongoing basis. So as we talked about, the Mrmd is responsible for, let me say it exactly the right way, the development, implementation, and maintenance of policies, but the MRSO is responsible for the proper, for the implementation and enforcement of these policies on an ongoing basis. It is a gray area, but you can think of it as the Mrmd is kind of in a supervisory role, and the MRSO is on the ground level making things safe and implementing and enforcing the requirements on a daily basis. MRSO is responsible for the development, documentation, and execution in conjunction with and under the authority of the Mrmd. Again, this is wording taken directly from the ACR, of safe working procedures for the MR environment. They're responsible for ensuring adequate written safety procedures, emergency procedures, and operating instructions are issued in consultation with both the Mrmd and MRSE. Responsible for ensuring the implementation and monitoring of appropriate measures for minimizing risks to staff and patients, again in cooperation with the Mrmd. MRSOs are responsible for managing hazards posed by the MR equipment and monitoring the measures taken to protect against such hazards. They're responsible for ensuring in cooperation with the Mrmd that medical, technical, nursing, emergency, and other relevant staff groups who may be exposed to the MR environment are educated appropriately and updated as necessary to MR safety requirements. Many of you know this has been a major push in the MR safety committee to improve how IUH educates folks that come down to the MR environment and work in the MR environment, how we ensure that people are meeting the annual training requirements. So again, the MRSO isn't doing this all on their own, but they are responsible for it. They have support from the MR safety experts, from the MR safety committee, from administration, from the Mrmd, but they are responsible for the implementation of the training. They're responsible for providing and ensuring the provision of MR safety education and training and cooperation, and as per the policies of the Mrmd, and maintaining such records. Almost all of the techs know that we have a website where you can direct people who are going to be coming down to your environment to work to take their training, and there is spreadsheets that are kept that allow you to check when they took their training and if they passed and what their score was, even what questions they missed. There's a lot more. MRSOs are responsible for consulting the Mrmd and or MRSE when they need further advice. They're responsible for reporting back to the Mrmd in a timely fashion any and all MR safety related issues. Responsible for ensuring there's a clear policy for purchasing, testing, and clearly marking of all equipment that will go into Zone 3 and Zone 4. They're responsible for providing safety advice on the modification of protocols in cooperation with the Mrmd. In our organization, we tend to have the MRSEs heavily involved in this portion. And so although the Mrso will be responsible for ensuring that modifications to protocols are safe, as most of you know, our physicists tend to be very involved in this activity in IUH. They're responsible for maintaining regular contact with other relevant groups or committees, and providing expertise in root cause analysis, solutions meetings, et cetera, related to adverse events. Last but not least, the MRSE. This individual is expected to serve as a resource for the Mrmd and the Mrso. So this would be someone like myself, a physicist, who provides expertise in non-medically related MR safety issues. The ACR does state that these should be issues other than contrast agents, anxiolytics, I don't know what that word is, and other pharmaceuticals. It is assumed that the Mrmd and Mrso are part of the organization performing the scan. However, the MRSE can be external to the organization. You're going to hear me advocate, or you have heard me advocate, and I'll continue to advocate today, that I think our MRSEs at all IUH sites should be internal and come from the group of MRSEs that we have identified in our medical physics group at IUH that is primarily centered in Indianapolis. The reason for that is I'd like to have as much homogeneity across all of our different hospitals as possible. When you get other organizations involved, there can be different interpretations on safety issues, and it can lead to confusion. So I'm a big advocate for using our MRSEs like myself, Shendong, and others that will have to be your MRSE regardless of which hospital you're at. MRSE is often, I would say most often, an MR physicist, but you can have other people fill this role. I've seen an architect fill this role in one instance. However, to be identified as the MRSE, you do have to take the MRSE versions of the module tests, and they are very technical. So certainly anyone can be the MRSE, but you do have to solve equations and other stuff to pass the test. It is expected that the MRSE will serve an advisory role for one or several MR facilities, thereby does not need to be physically present at the MR facility, although a prospectively and clearly defined means to contact this individual is expected. Responsibilities of the MRSE as dictated by the ACR, providing advice on the engineering, scientific, and administrative aspects of the safe use of MR equipment. This includes quantification assistance of energy, force, and risk exposure. So you can think about things like SAR, torques that might be encountered, heating, other physical phenomena that occur in the MR environment that need to be quantitatively assessed. MRSEs are responsible for providing advice on the development and continuing evaluation of a safety framework for the MR environment. As almost all of you know, that is one of our primary roles at IUH and chairing the MR Safety Committee. MRSEs provide advice for the development of local rules and procedures to ensure the safe use of the MR equipment. They are responsible for providing safety advice regarding non-routine MR procedures. One that jumps out at everyone is probably the active role we've had our physicists take in scanning implanted devices such as unsafe pacemakers, unsafe ICDs, more recently cochlear implants that at times do not meet the requirements initially set out, approved by the FDA. VNS devices are becoming more and more an issue. DBS devices, which are conditional but still require a lot of support. So this is an area where our physicists and MRSEs are very active already. They're responsible for providing advice on the choice of the MR safety programs and MR quality assurance programs, evaluations, and audits. They're responsible for providing safety advice regarding equipment acceptance testing. All of you probably know our physicists are completely responsible for acceptance testing at IUH. And we do have an MR safety component of our acceptance testing that you should see on your report. We're responsible for establishing and maintaining links with appropriate regional and professional bodies on reporting back to the Mrmd and Mrso on safety related issues. We do a lot of this in the MR Safety Committee. And finally, providing expertise in root cause analysis, solutions meetings, etc., related to MR adverse events. All right, so we're 30 minutes in. That was all of what I felt was the really boring stuff. So I hope most of you are still here and benefiting. Again, if you have any questions, please do interrupt me. I'm more than happy to stop and answer any questions. So we're going to move on a little bit and start to talk about some new topic areas. Does anyone have any questions about these regulatory changes, about the new ACR MR Safety Manual, about legal exposure, or who's in charge, who's responsible for what?
Hey, Jason. This is Jason Ford. I'm a
Hi.
radiologist at IU West. Did you happen to see what kind of success rates at all for the suits against the Mrmd?
For taking the test?
No, for a lawsuit that was the
lawsuit.
the Mrmd is named in. Is there like a success rate on those?
I did not have that. That may very well be something that is talked about in this article right here, though. And I'll tell you what, as a follow-up action, I'm just going to make a quick note here. So as a follow-up action, I'll see if there are any kind of quantitative assessments of the lawsuits and the results of the lawsuits. I will say, in all of the lawsuits that I read yesterday, in all cases, the liability was covered by medical malpractice insurance for the Mrmd, and the liability in all cases was covered by hospital insurance for both the hospital and the technologist when they were named in the suit. And the vast majority, I think I only saw one that went to trial. All of them were settlements. Some of them were like for 30K, and several of them were over $1 million. So it obviously depends on how serious the incident is. But I didn't see a case where insurance didn't cover the liability.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions along that line? All right. Okay, so what is our tentative plan that we're implementing today to meet the new certification requirements of the MR Safety Manual? We're going to certify and appoint an Mrmd for each site. The Mrmd does not have to be physically present at each site, but they should have active and ongoing communications with, and at least at times be physically present at the site. This could be in terms of image interpretation, administrative duties, and safety duties. So you want to choose an Mrmd who you can pick the phone up and get a hold of relatively easily. And it should be an Mrmd that you know on a somewhat personal basis and can feel comfortable that you will physically see, or at least virtually see nowadays, on a semi-regular basis. People who have asked, like, well, how often should that be? And I've recommended weekly. So I think if you're going to choose an Mrmd, it'd be great if that Mrmd was physically present at your site at least once a week. The ACR does not give any specific guidelines here. So in theory, they don't have to be there at all. But obviously, we want you to have someone that you can reach out to quickly and someone who understands the layout of your facility and some of the challenges that might have led to safety incidents or concerns about safety in your facility. We are going to certify and appoint an MRSO, and I should say it is expected that there will be Mrmds who are responsible for multiple sites. So if you think about the Beltway, it might make sense to have one Mrmd for all the Beltway sites. Maybe it makes sense to have one Mrmd for Morgan and Bloomington. I don't know. We'll have to think about all this. But it's expected that you'll have Mrmds that cover multiple sites. However, for MRSOs, we're going to certify and appoint an MRSO for each site, and that MRSO should be a technologist whose primary clinical service responsibilities are at that site. So they can moonlight or work part-time at other facilities, But the MRSO for your site should be a technologist whose primary employment is at your site, which of course means they're physically present at the site many days a week, you know, 4, I would say at a minimum, something like that. And third, we're going to certify and appoint an MRSE for each site. The MRSE should be a medical physicist with their primary clinical service responsibilities within the organization. So this speaks a little bit to, so this is IUH wording. This is my wording, I should say, MRSC wording. It's not ACR wording. But as I mentioned before, I really want to see us use MRSEs from our organization. I know we do have many sites that get physics testing from outside services. And there's good reasons for that at times, but I do feel strongly that the MR safety experts should be internal, because these are going to be people that have ongoing relationships with your physicians, with your technologists, and that understand the policies of IUH and are on the same page with your physicians and technologists. So the MRSE should have ongoing communications with the site, and we expect they will have a physical presence at the site on approximately an annual basis. I put this in because for most sites, our MRSEs do also do the annual MRQA testing. And so they are physically present at your site once a year for most of our sites. They do have an understanding of the zoning. They have an understanding of how the doors are set up, how access is set up. They know the people and should be able to assess incidents or safety concerns pretty quickly. So that is our plan. As far as tests, passing criteria, certification, and maintenance, we have designed this course such that there are 8 modules. So today is module 1. Upon completion of all 8 modules and completion of the test, you will be certified by IUH/IU as an MRMD, MRSO, and/or MRSE, depending on your role. Each module requires you pass a test with a minimum score of 80%. The tests are, I wouldn't say easy. They're relatively difficult. They're going to be administered via Qualtrics. Up until a few days ago, had it set to where if you failed the test, i.e. got less than 80%, you had to take a week. You had to take a week off before you could retake it. And the reason is we don't want a bunch of people just sitting in there retaking it over and over again until they get it right. But I did change that this morning so that you can retake it immediately or as many times as you need, at least for this first test. I'm going to be soliciting feedback from you all after this first test to get an idea of how hard it was, whether or not it makes sense to have a cooling off period so people go back and rewatch this presentation before they retake it. But for now, you'll be able to retake it until you get a minimum score of 80%. Once you've reached that minimum score of 80% on all 8 modules, you'll be able to print a certification diploma from the MRSC website anytime. You'll just be able to log in and hit print, and it will create a PDF for you that shows your certification dates, how, you know, and when your certification is up, and it will show whether or not you're in good standing in terms of maintenance of certification. Certification will be good for 3 years, after which time you'll have to recomplete the modules. You'll receive a link to take the test for the current module during this presentation, and you're going to be able to access a video of this recording on our website, which is MRSC, so MR Safety Committee .sitehost.iu.edu. That's on the test, so definitely want to pay attention to it. I'm looking in my emails right now, and I'm seeing the Qualtrics email giving everyone access to the test has not hit my email inbox, which makes me think it didn't get sent. Does anyone else have their email pulled up? And if you do you see an email from me from about 19 minutes ago? It should have been at 9:20, giving you the link to take the test.
This is Larry, and I do.
Sorry, I don't have anything from you.
Okay. Larry, did you say you don't?
I do not.
Okay. That's unfortunate.
I don't either, Jason Ford.
Okay, so I'm going to, for whatever reason it didn't send, I am going to, you'll just have to wait until right after the presentation, and I will resend the link to everyone immediately right after the presentation. Sorry about that. I'm still figuring out Qualtrics. Okay. Okay, moving on a little bit. So how is MR safety organized and administered at IUH? We use an MR safety committee, which I refer to as the MRSC. MR safety committees are not required by the ACR or by the Joint Commission. However, almost all large hospital systems use MR safety committees. They are considered good practice because it helps you get a lot of different people at the table, oversee all the different issues that are ongoing, and try to push out policies that create some homogeneity in terms of safety across your organization. The MRSC at IUH reports directly into the IUH Imaging Clinical Council. So I chair the MRSC. We meet bi-monthly, every 2 months. And then we report back to the Imaging Clinical Council, which is co-chaired by Dr. Dunkel and Todd Stanley. And then, of course, the Imaging Clinical Council rolls up to the nebulous IU Health. I'm not exactly sure where it rolls up to. Our MRSC is actually stipulated by IUH policy, so it's written in policy that we will have an MRSC. It is open to all IUH Eskenazi and IUSM employees. The MRSC reviews incidents. We recommend policy changes. We review equipment for the system. Like when the system is thinking about purchasing new equipment, we provide clinical consultation, especially in difficult implants or difficult patients. We administer ACR and Joint Commission training requirements. In terms of how policies are created and amended with our existing MRSC, and again, I want to emphasize the MRMD going forward is going to be responsible for this process, but that doesn't mean the MRMD has to do the process. It's going to be the MRSO, the MRSE, the MR Safety Committee working in collaboration with the MRMD to help the MRMD meet their responsibilities. So our MRSC reviews clinical problems and incidents on a regular basis. We try to develop or modify IUH policy to improve MR safety. Sometimes we spin off subcommittees where we'll bring in people from like cardiology and EP and nursing and other disciplines. We've brought in people from neurosurgery where we try to come up with a new policy that's going to work out in the clinic, especially when it's multidisciplinary. Simpler changes we just essentially make within the MR Safety Committee via email. We have people give feedback on proposed changes. We vote and then we send them to the Imaging Clinical Council. After adoption by the MRSC, so when a policy is modified by the MRSC, it is not active yet. There's 2 routes it can go. If we want to push it out for statewide acceptance, so all of our hospitals will follow this new policy, it has to go to the Imaging Clinical Council because that council is the multi-institutional, I should say, council that can review the policy and make sure it's appropriate for all sites. If it's just for, let's just use the Academic Health Center as an example, if it's just a change that the MRSC is making for the AHC, it has to go to the QA committee, then it has to go to GEO chiefs, then it has to go to the Policy Oversight Committee. They get it up in policy stat. Once it's in policy stat, it gets signed by about 5 different people. Once the final signature is acquired, then it's live. So policies don't go live until they reach this final step. If we were going to push a statewide initiative out, which we have not done yet, we would first submit it to the Imaging Clinical Council. And then this process would continue for each site. So the AHC would then implement the policy change for its policies using this existing process, but I don't know, IU West might have a slightly different process. Maybe they don't have GEO chiefs. They have a QA committee and something that's essentially a policy oversight committee. And maybe Bloomington does it a little different. The point is that after it goes through the Imaging Clinical Council, each site is responsible for following their own policy approval process to then adopt the new policy. We do have processes available. We've developed these recently to deal with pushy patients and pushy ordering physicians. We've had a lot of these as MR has evolved in the last few years. Our MR safety policies generally are not patient satisfiers. Ironically, we're doing it to protect the patients, and usually the patients really don't like what we're doing. One good example, as everyone knows, is we now require patients to completely change out of all of their street clothing including their undergarments. Patients do not like that. We had a COVID patient, or excuse me, wasn't a COVID patient. We had a patient who was getting scanned at one of our hospitals recently who was very concerned about getting COVID and had done a bunch of research and gotten a respirator from 3M that they were positive was MR compatible, and they had this written certification from 3M that it was MR compatible. However, that would have violated our policy because it's an outside clothing article. In consultation with me, we decided to not allow that patient to be scanned with the respirator. I then called the patient and explained the situation to them and why our policy is the way it is, and talked to the patient for like 45 minutes. And so we have these processes available. We recently had a patient that had new piercings. They'd been told by the place where they got the piercings that the piercings were MR compatible. So now they showed up and were ready to have their MRI scan. The technologist correctly told them they couldn't get scanned with these piercings per policy. There was a lot of discussion. Patient was turned away and rescheduled. I then called the patient's mother and had a long discussion about why the patient had to remove the piercings for the MR procedure. We have situations with referring physicians who are quote unquote pushy, and they're doing it because they know or feel at least that the exam is safe and will be good for their patient. So I think they're motivated by the right things, but they don't necessarily have the technical understanding that we in radiology have as it relates to MR safety. We have ENTs that often feel that our cochlear implant patients can be scanned regardless of whether or not we have the correct head wrap, or whether or not the FDA language is actually approved in the US versus Canada, because they feel that the cochlear implant is safe. And in many times, I think they are right, it is safe, but it's a violation of policy. And so in those cases, we get an Mrmd to talk with the ordering physician. They can then speak the same language, understand the pros and cons of the procedure, and hopefully the radiologist can help the ordering physician understand if there's a better procedure they could use that doesn't carry the risks that MR has. Same thing in cardiology. Cardiology has been wonderfully aggressive in scanning patients with unsafe pacemakers. I'm a big advocate of providing this service. I think it's a service that we should provide as an academic medical center. It's a service that many patients have lost their lives because they weren't able to get, especially in rural areas. So it's an important service to provide. It is generally safe to provide this service if you follow guidelines. But there are risks associated with it. And sometimes the cardiologists want to scan just as many protocols as they would scan on a normal patient. And as many of you know, we have our own policy and our own procedures in place to scan these patients in a way that we think is safe and hopefully accomplishes the needs of the ordering physician. In this case, again, we have the MRMD/radiologist reach out to the cardiologist, talk about the patient, talk about their needs, talk about what the cardiologist needs to make their assessments. I do want to emphasize, I know in some quarters, I guess all of us at times give in to the peer pressure, especially when it's coming from a physician, but also an aggressive patient where they're like, just do it. It's fine. Just do it. I know it's fine. My friend at USC does it all the time. You should never just do it though. You should all know that you can reach out to your Mrse, you can reach out to the Mrmd, you can reach out to the Mrso, you can reach out to the MR safety committee and get support to make these decisions. You should never feel like you're kind of out on an island and taking risk. Okay, let's get a little more technical. I'm going to hurry through the end of this part. There are 4 major physical phenomenon that we deal with on every patient. There's the static field, which we measure in Tesla. That's referred to as B0. There's the spatial magnetic field gradient, which we refer to as delta B0. It's measured in units of Tesla per meter and less commonly in Gauss per centimeter. I guess, hopefully easy to interpret for you all. Delta B0 is just how fast B0 is changing across space. So you might have 1.5 T at the center of the magnet, but you might have a change of like 8 Tesla per meter in a certain part of the magnet where there might be active shielding and the field is changing really quickly. And that change in field has its own set of risks associated with it for implants and equipment. There are time varying magnetic field gradients. These are the gradients that we're all more familiar with, that we refer to as the imaging gradients that produce the loud knocking sounds. We measure them in very similar units except millitesla per meter because the gradient is much smaller than the spatial magnetic field gradient. And we have time varying RF fields. This is when we pump RF into the patient to excite the nuclei. We measure the absorption of that RF using SAR, which many of you are familiar with, which is measured in watts per kilogram. That's the absorbed energy. A newer quantity that is being used now is B1 plus RMS, which is measured in microtesla. This is just simply the magnetic field that an implant is exposed to as a result of the RF being pumped into the patient. These are the 4 primary concerns that we worry about when someone walks in with a pacemaker, or someone assures us that some new computer monitor is safe to go into zone 4. We want, as MR experts, we need to be familiar with these 4 physical phenomenon and understand what the risks are associated with each of them. The static field, again, of course, this is created by a superconducting magnet. It's 1.5 T or 3 T or 1 T in some cases at isocenter. And then it has different values outside of the scanner bore. And you can see where the field is changing rapidly here. This is an area where you're going to have a high spatial field gradient. We're talking right now about just the static magnetic field B0, which is here. Oh, I see the Qualtrics just sent out. So it just sent out at a different time. Hopefully, check your email, everyone. Hopefully you just got the link to the Qualtrics. We measure this field in Tesla. This field can quickly accelerate ferromagnetic objects. It can also create current flow if you move an object through the field. When we're trying to decide if an object is safe enough to go into the MR room, and we're asked, starting with the physical phenomenon of the static magnetic field, the first question we want to ask is, could this object become a missile? It's not usually a concern for implants, which usually within a short period of time after surgery are relatively stable in the patient's body. It is a major concern for oxygen tanks, IV poles, wheelchairs, beds, especially things on wheels. This effect is the effect that kills people and kills people like it still is killing people. We had somebody die in 2018. We continue to have many near miss and extreme injuries that come out of this effect. We should all be treating this effect with the utmost seriousness. Never become complacent with respect to the missile effect. Even though it's an older effect that a lot of things have been kind of figured out for in the past, it still is of utmost concern. Oops. This effect happens at IU Health. This is an example from Methodist Hospital at the end of last year. We had an IV pole that had on marker MRI written on the bottom of it. That was supposed to imply that this IV pole belonged to MRI, the MRI department, not that it was MR compatible. A technologist mistakenly thought it meant it was MR compatible, took it in. A patient was on the bed in the scanner, and this large piece of metal was pulled and attached directly to the magnet. Some folks tried to remove it at that time, which caused it to shift. One thing we all want to be aware of is when something gets pinned against the magnet, you should not be trying to remove it. You should be pulling the patient out and getting out of the room. When you try to move it, all you do is create the opportunity for it to shift and possibly do further damage. So this was a major incident. The patient did not get hurt, but it was a very close call. The total cost for this was $57,738 to bring the magnet down and then ramp it back up. It was down for 5.5 days. Again, this just happened within the last year at IU Health. A similar example from Bloomington, many of you are familiar with. Over time, some of the techs had become accustomed to allowing these transport chairs to come into zone 3. Unfortunately, what happened one day was a mother who had been driving the transport chair with her child decided she was going to take the transport chair into zone 4. The zone 4 door was open. The patient was sitting on the table. This was a near miss. Obviously, this patient could have been killed. I mean, if the patient had been in the scanner bore, they could have been killed. It's a very, very serious incident that happened in the last year at IU Health. The cost was a little lower. It cost $37,000 to fix this, to bring the magnet down and pull the equipment off. Had downtime of 1 3/4 days. This stuff it's been around for a long time. Everyone's known about it for a long time. We tend to get complacent about it, but it is still here and very real and very dangerous. The static spatial magnetic field gradient, again, that's how the field is changing around the edges of the scanner. Tends to be less of a concern. It is significantly enhanced for actively shielded magnets. And so some of you may be familiar with actively shielded magnets have coils right around this edge of the bore that repel the field. And the purpose of actively shielding magnets is to reduce the fringe field, so you can put magnets in smaller areas and you don't have to put steel in the walls and all kinds of stuff like that. The problem is they cause the field to change really quickly, which creates really high delta B zeros. And these delta B zeros can affect devices, both implants and equipment. When someone wants to bring an implant or equipment into zone 4, we need to ask ourselves whether or not the spatial magnetic field gradient that the object is safe at will be exceeded by our magnet when we do this by looking at these maps. This is considered one of the least concerning for MR safety. It's one of the primary reasons we disqualify patients, implants, and other devices though. Spatial magnetic field gradient. This is an example from Morgan County Hospital where we had a patient with iliac stents. Radiologist was notified ahead of time that there was a limit of 720 gauss per centimeter on the spatial magnetic field. The scanner at Morgan had a max field higher than that. We then started looking for other scanners and found the Symphony at MMP East that did meet the requirements. But you have to, consider where the patient's going to be in the scanner bore and where the implant was. In this case, these iliac implants. If the patient was laid directly on the table and didn't move their hips up or sideways at all, we can ensure that they wouldn't violate this field. Some of you may remember back in 2015, a gun went off at the VA, in the Indianapolis VA. This was due to a spatial magnetic field gradient. I guess I would caveat it with it was due to someone taking a gun into the MR environment, but that is another story. But the spatial magnetic field gradient can cause things to move. And so something like a gun, if it's cocked, will go off, or could go off, I should say. And the person was actually shot in this case. Time varying magnetic field, this is the imaging gradients that we're all more familiar with. It refers to how steep the gradients are and how quickly they change. These imaging gradients are turned on and off repeatedly, and that causes the MR sound. That's why they're called time varying. This rapid switching of polarity can induce a current. So if you have, it's kind of like AC current. If you have polarity switching really quick back and forth, you'll have electrons in a wire or some other conducting material going back and forth, which is the definition of alternating current. This can cause like appendages in patients to move because you can stimulate currents in the nervous system. It can even cause hallucinations. People say they see stars and they see flashes of bright light. There have even been reports of audio hallucinations. When we're trying to decide if an object or an implant is safe enough to go into the MR room, we need to look at the maximum magnetic field gradient amplitude and the slew rate and make sure that the object is safe at the maximum magnetic field gradient amplitude and slew rates for the equipment. I couldn't find an example of having a problem with this at IU, but I'm sure the technologists can tell us times where they've excluded patients because of it. Finally, there's the fourth one, which is the time varying RF field, which we refer to as B1. This is the RF that gets pumped into the patient to excite the nuclei. This is measured in units of watts per kilogram when we're talking about SAR, or in microtesla when we're using the new quantity B1 plus RMS. I just want to show what the RF field looks like in the Z direction. It drops off relatively fast when you get away from the RF coils. And you can actually see a 3D simulation of the RF field here. What I want to bring your attention to is that this RF field is, for the most part, confined to the scanner bore. So with magnetic fields, we're often worried about how they're changing out here or what effect they might have to someone, you know, outside the bore. The RF fields generally are confined to the bore itself, and you can see that here and with this plot. They cause eddy currents in metals. Those eddy currents release heat. So when we're trying to decide if an object or a patient or an implant is safe to get scanned, the fourth thing we need to determine is whether or not the maximum RF field limit is going to be violated. This can lead to catastrophic internal heating and paralysis and other stuff. So it is very serious, probably the second most serious physical phenomenon we worry about. This is an example of one danger or one incident we had. This was from Ball. There was an intubated and sedated patient who had a conditional spinal stimulator. The conditions required that the implant be reprogrammed and that they used a TR head coil so that the RF field was kept very small where it exposed the patient. We had a weekend technologist who was doing the scanning, and they were unaware for a variety of reasons of the implant and went ahead and scanned the patient using normal head procedures. When I was notified about this, I talked with the Mrmd and the Mrso / administrator. The first thing I wanted to find out about was thermal injuries. We could evaluate whether or not the device had moved at all using x-rays, but the harder part is figuring out whether or not this device had received a bunch of RF power that it then converted into eddy currents and caused internal burning in the patient. Because the patient was intubated and sedated, they couldn't tell us necessarily if they had thermal injuries. They may not be able to communicate that. So it's a major concern. So we had radiography performed to show that it didn't shift. We interrogated the pocket where the pulse generator was and found that there was no swelling, redness, or other irritation. Had a representative for the manufacturer come in and confirm that it was still working correctly. And then we had the Mrse, in this case it was me, go into the DICOM data and actually reconstruct the SAR data from all of the DICOM headers. And I calculated a total RF on time of 8 minutes and 24 seconds. And the highest average whole body SAR was 0.61. These are both very low for an unsafe pacemaker, which is probably the most conservative case. We use a limit of 1.5 watts per kilogram, so we were less than half that in this patient. So we all felt that after reviewing what happened in the incident, we could assure that the patient was okay. Okay, that's it. So I know I went over a little bit and I apologize. An overview of the rest of the course. So today I was supposed to talk for 45 minutes. Looks like I talked for an hour and 2 minutes. Sorry about that. The next one will be next week. Shendong, our other resident MR physicist and MR safety expert, will be talking about static fields, time varying fields, and implants specifically. So this will be very technical. We're going to have Dr. Musa Al-Hamami, who is one of our physics residents, talk about GVCAs. We'll have Emily Diller, one of our physics residents, talk about quench and cryogen safety. I will then give another lecture on the ACR MR safety manual and all the specifics of it. Greg Anthony and Michael Abel, two more of our physics residents, will talk about zoning, screening, and MR and non-MR personnel designations. Amy Gallagher talked to Mary Kay Foster, who's a special pathogens and infection control and prevention specialist. I haven't actually asked her about this, but Amy has. We're planning on Mary Kay giving the discussion on infection control. We do think this should include some information on COVID. And then I'm still looking for someone to talk about medico-legal implications. I'd like this to be a radiologist / an Mrmd because this is so important, obviously, to the Mrmd. If anyone on the phone would like to take on this challenge and do the presentation for us, please let me know. I'd be more than happy to not do it myself. If you know someone else that you think is already well accustomed and could talk to this or would like to learn about it and talk about it, let me know. I'd be more than happy to have them take over. If not, it'll probably fall to me at the end. All right, it's time for open discussion and questions. Just note, you should have received your personal link for this test module in your email now. Don't share it. It's not because this is super secret, but because the link that you got is personalized to your email address. And that's how I can go in and verify that you did pass each module because it's tied to the email address that I have for you on file. If you do have someone else you want to have get the link, just email them to me. I saw Brandy just sent me someone just now. I will get them plugged in on Qualtrics so that they receive the link. And then they'll just simply be able to go onto the website and watch this video and then take the test. Again, I apologize for the lot of speaking that you all had to endure. I see there's a lot going on in the chat window. I'll open that. Is there anyone who in the meantime would like to ask a question or start open discussion?
Jason, this is Larry. You said we could take this anytime, correct?
You can take it anytime. It doesn't expire. Yeah. I had initially planned on making you take it within 3 days. Well, but for now, you can take it as many times as you want and it doesn't expire.
Great, thanks.
Yep. Okay, it looks like all the chat room stuff was related to, except for one, was related to the email. So I got my email. Larry, can you tell me, did you get your email?
I did.
Okay, so I had 59 people on the list, and I know many of you have reached out to me and asked me to add people to our list. And I have Miss Julia Payton. She kind of maintains that list. She's not here today. If for some reason you're missing someone that you wanted to have get the email that didn't get it, let me know. I will go in and add them to the list right now in Qualtrics and send them an invite. I apologize. I know it's been really hard making sure we got everybody who needed to be involved. But I appreciate your patience with us. Any other questions or discussion items? Dr. Moran asks, are there any accompanying documents? There are not, but I would be more than happy to send the all the documents that are referenced in this presentation out to this group. So let me make a note. I will do that. I think that's easy and I can do it quickly. I can also add them to the website, Dr. Moran, and you would be able to access them when you watch the video on the website too. So I'll do that as well. Any other questions, concerns, discussion topics?
This is Jason Ford. I still haven't received the quiz yet.
Okay, you are on the list. I do remember checking that you were on the list. So,
yeah, I haven't seen it either. It's Beth.
Beth is on the list too. Okay, maybe give Qualtrics, I like set this up so that it would send at a certain time. My email showed up 30 minutes after. I had put it to send at 9:20 and then I got mine at like 9:50. So if you don't mind, give it a little more time, like maybe 30 minutes or so, or an hour. If you don't have it by then, send me an email and I will go through each email that I get and make sure you're on the list in Qualtrics and resend you a link. And I have found that if I send the link immediately, it goes. It seems to be this automating it to send later that is a little funky for some reason. Dr. Agarwal, can you send the website? I will send the website address. Yes, I will send that to you all when I send out the materials. Brandy, are you making the presentations available? For instance, Dr. Arvin was just requested to be added. Yes, the presentations, I'm recording them, including with all this Q&A, sorry, and I'm going to then put them on the website and anyone will be able to go watch them and then send a request to me to be added to the Qualtrics test list and be able to take the test. So there's no limits. All the material will be publicly on the website. Okay, seeing if I have anything else.
Hey, Jason Parker, this is James at Eagle Highlands.
Hey.
I'm wondering, do we plan on having a location where we can kind of see the hierarchy for each site? Who is that site's MRSO, who is their Mrmd, and who is their Mrse?
Right, that's a great question. And I think one of the challenges is we know that we need an Mrmd, an Mrso, and an Mrse. We just haven't quite figured out who's going to do it at each site. I think that we could come up with an example for the AHC and then maybe like one for the Beltway probably. And I bring those two up just because I'm more intricately involved with them from working downtown. So I could potentially try to make sure that those models are solidified and then share that with the group. And then you could use that and kind of deciding how you want to, because the Beltway would be one situation where you have, one MRMD covering a bunch of smaller imaging sites, not really hospitals, where you have the MRSE covering a lot of different sites, but then you have an MRSO at each site. And the AHC would be like the bigger, more formal version where you hopefully have an MRMD who's physically present on a regular basis, and multiple MRSOs and MRSEs who are physically present on a regular basis too. So I'm going to make a note of that as well. Does that sound like did that address your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Jason, so I'm assuming then you are, will keep documentation of who the MRMDs are for each site? Is that your responsibility? Or who's, I mean, for instance, like Blackford has a mobile MR unit. So I'm not going to be the MRMD for Blackford, but I don't know who it is, who it would be.
Okay.
And then Jay County, so one of those doctors up there will have to be the MRMD.
Okay.
How is that, or is that going to be like Josh Allen is going to have to?
I would think that it would fall under the radiology administrator, like Josh Allen in this case, to work with the potential MRMDs and figure out what the best arrangement is, and then make sure that they then go get the training. That's what my intuition tells me. I wasn't planning on me or the MR safety committee even kind of saying who the MRMDs are and who the MRSOs are, because it really, depends a lot more on how things work. You all know your organizations and some of these details better than I do, or than anyone on the MRSC does. But I think that the responsibility falls in my opinion, on the radiology administrator, because they know about these new rules from the ACR. They're signing off on the ACR accreditation packet. And I think that they should be working with their physicists, their technologists, and their radiologists to kind of come up with this structure. So I guess that's how I've approached it so far, but I recognize that it may not be an easy, puzzle to solve in some instances. I'd be more than willing to have the MR safety committee keep a kind of quote unquote overall or master list of the of all sites and who their MRMD, MRSO, and MRSE are. I would be more than happy to do that. And then once we develop that, we could see where the weak points were, or where there was confusion, or where there were some places that maybe didn't have an MRMD, and we could reach out to the radiology administrators and alert them of that. Maybe, does that sound like a good solution?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
that might be helpful. We're
Okay.
having a department meeting today, so I'll bring it up with Josh.
Okay, great. Any other questions? I don't see any new chats. All right. Again, I really do apologize for all the talking. And I know that you all are very busy and have lots of stuff to do. I'm going to try to make these as painless as possible while still making sure we're meeting the requirements of ACR and having you all feel educated enough to take on these new roles and responsibilities. Feel free to call me or reach out to me at any time. You can get my cell phone number from the website or from my email. Feel free to call me anytime if you have questions about anything, or email. With that said, thank you for participating in our first module, and everyone have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.